We're going to look at a book from the National Trust showing some of their nice things. But before we do that, I've got a couple of comments about the National Trust in England. So it's a National Trust nowadays is run for the membership, and it's become a populist, sort of fairly liberal, fairly left-wing organisation, and they are starting to become a sort of trophy hunting landowner, and they are starting to introduce really left-wing policies. For example, a lot of the wealth which the National Trust looks after came about in the slaving era, and the National Trust are now very worried about that because a lot of the membership are sensitive to that. So the National Trust is starting to sort of rewrite history and close down on certain narratives. But the problem really, looking back, is the National Trust was not founded by left-wing people and the population. The National Trust was founded by a tiny hand-picked group of wealthy individuals, and I'm afraid to say that they wanted to have nice areas preserved for the benefit of themselves. You know, you could say, oh, they were doing it for public good. They weren't really. They were doing it because they wanted nice things to be kept. It wasn't totally about a small group of aristocrats 100 years ago trying to save particular things in England or Wales or Scotland or Ireland. It's my own version of it. Everyone will disagree with me. That's what I think. The National Trust was a right-wing landed gentry landowner, a semi-aristocratic drive to keep things nice. Going back 200 years before them, if you had a nice country house, you would have roads rerouted to make your view better. You would have villages knocked down and moved to make your view better. You would have lakes put in to make your view better. And it's not quite the same as that, but there is something in it. The other thing about the National Trust, which I dislike, is they like to have properties with legacies nowadays, and they won't take a property that needs repair unless it has a lot of money with it or an income with it. It's unlike the situation 100 years ago or 50 years ago where they would take on a property in a bad state and just spend the money on it. They're very canny and want to make sure they have enough money. And recently, and in the medium historical past of the institution, they've taken buildings on from aristocrats who couldn't afford to repair them, and they've said to the landowners, if you give us your building, you can stay living in it while you're still alive, and your family can stay in this when you die. So you'll find lots and lots of houses in England which the National Trust own, but the family that gave it to them have a wing, have a house in the estate. They're allowed the house on Christmas Day. They're allowed the house 6 weekends a year. That sort of thing. So it's quite strange. And the other thing about it, this is the great National Trust mistruth, is that when they take a property over, the property is embalmed and it's frozen in time. So if they had taken a house over in the 1920s, for example, the stables, the house will not have developed further with subsequent generations of the family, and that house won't have garages, for example, won't have gas-fired central heating, won't have a television in it, for example, won't have modern wiring in it. So it's embalmed. It stops living. The house stops living in 1920. And if, for example, they take a house over in 1960, the stables are all emptied out and there's cars, and the house will have garages, the house will have an Aga, the house will have toilets, flushing toilets. So when the National Trust gets these properties, which have developed over thousands of years or hundreds of years, as soon as they get it, the house is euthanized. It stops developing as it would otherwise develop if it was still lived in by the family. So it's a falsehood. It's a total falsehood. So when you go and see National Trust property in England, be aware that when they took it over, it was embalmed and preserved in aspect, and it hasn't continued as it was meant to. So you might have a house, say, built in 1500 with a Georgian wing and a Edwardian wing, but it'll never have a 20th century wing, a late 20th century wing, because the National Trust embalmed them. And I understand why they do it, because they're trying to preserve it, but it's not like another country house where they continue to develop. So there are criticisms of the National Trust, and they are nowadays trying to buy status properties, which can be land only, or more land, or buildings, but they don't really want to get involved with industrial buildings. They're not very good with churches. And they won't buy an old steamship. They're very land centric. And what I find annoying is they're buying land which is listed. They bought Snowdonia to preserve it, but it didn't need preserving because it was a national park. So no one could buy it and change it. It doesn't matter who owns it. No one can change it. They buy buildings which are listed grade 1. No one can buy those houses, change the colour of the paint, change anything. No one can spoil them, and the council can stop any owner letting it fall into disrepair. So the National Trust doesn't actually need to buy them to preserve them. They're buying buildings which already have preservation orders on them and have protection. But they're not buying the buildings that are being lost. The buildings that are being lost are not the very best ones. It's the second division ones. They're being lost because they haven't got the protection. And all the time in England, these buildings are going. Okay, so we'll talk about the book. So in the book, this really is showing the variety of stuff on show, and has the things you'd expect. There is the pictures. There are the pictures. The armour, the beautiful handmade objects, maps and books, and it goes through all these lovely, wonderful things to some more mundane things, and the visitors nowadays are quite interested in the mundane things. So in a country house now, visitors are as interested in the kitchen from the 1930s or 1950s, the scullery. They're as interested in the kitchen as they are in the state rooms. Locks, door furniture, musical instruments, taxidermy, sculpture, stained glass windows, embroideries, tapestries, rugs, needlework, carriages, landau, bicycles, cars. So you can see that there's a lot of stuff that they do look after: buildings, contents, farmland, moorland, and they do a lot of good. Of course, they do a lot of good. But we just had a chat about some of the other aspects. Thank you.